at what local governments explore ranked ballot initiatives or something like that? Have you studied those as sort of a way to start a conversation?
You know, there's a lot of support for ranked ballots. Dave Meslin in Ontario has done a lot of work around ranked ballots. You know, and of course, what are the advantages of ranked ballots? The advantages are that it removes some of the strategic dilemma that voters face, right? Voters go to the polls and they think, oh gosh, I really like so-and-so, but I'm not sure if they really have a chance to win, so I better vote for this other person. And of course, the voters have a very difficult time knowing what other voters are going to do, particularly at the local level, where without party cues, voter turnout is lower, public knowledge is lower, very, very difficult situation. My own view is that ranked ballots don't go far enough. Ranked ballots don't address some of the abiding issues. If we are going to generate a dynamic policy discussion, and if we are going to see, you know, exciting ideas get into the mix and stay there, we need a really competitive system, a system that's going to allow new ideas to break in, or allow even old ideas to gain more purchase on the discussion. And only a proportional system will do that. And unfortunately, ranked ballots don't help us to address some of the other challenges that we need. We need voting systems that better represent the societies that we live in. We need voting systems that allow at least 50% of the representatives to be women. It's just no longer acceptable that the majority is not represented in our different legislative arenas. So, and here's my last point on the ranked ballot. While we often hear people talk about these as opportunities to transition, you know, well, here's a reform, and then maybe we can use that reform to build on a larger reform. But the evidence looking at changes of voting system across Western countries is that it almost never happens, right? If you change a voting system, that's the voting system you get, and that's the one you'll keep. Calgary used a ranked ballot from the early 60s to the early 70s. And funny enough, they actually were using a proportional system before that. So, you know, these decisions are made politically rather than functionally, right? They're not made for reasons about better performance or delivery. They're often about cui bono, who benefits. And right now, you know, you've got a government that is going to offer up this opening for a discussion about the voting system. And this does not happen a whole lot. It's happening more than I thought, but it's not happening a lot. And it cannot be overlooked, right? You got to snatch this opportunity to try to make it work. Yes?
Yes. Who is this unnamed?
Name them!
I didn't want to dignify.
Are you sure they all
I think some of the people here can probably let you know who that unnamed source is.
Starts with Bill.
Starts with Bill and ends with Tillman. But look, I mean, Bill's an easy target, but you know, Bill is coming from a certain understanding of how progressive parties operate in unfair societies. The problem is he's toting a line from the 1930s. Right? He's toting a line that the British Labour Party came up with in the 1930s, looking at what was going on across Western countries. Here's the backstory, right? You've got a huge upheaval around World War I. Most Western countries only shift to the minimum conditions of democracy around World War I. So much later than people realize. And that's certainly true on the continent in Western Europe. And part of that deal was basically the drivers of proportional representation were conservatives. Right? Conservatives were terrified that the working class were going to be a majority, that if we give them the vote, they're going to overrun us and take away everything we've got. Well, it turned out that working people weren't quite as self-interested and venal as their right-wing friends had been before them, and they didn't vote in such one-dimensional blocks. But what the Labour Party saw was that the center-right were conspiring against the left and preventing them from doing anything on the continent, despite the fact some of them were very large parties. And so the Labour Party said, no, we better stick with first past the post. First past the post will let us get in power, put in our policies, and resist the right so that people can get the benefits of it. I mean, it made sense, logically. I could totally see why they thought that was true. It's just turned out to be wrong, right? The continental left-wing parties, who never had a majority, except the Swedish Social Democrats once or twice, they were much more able to introduce progressive policies precisely because they could take up the public space and shame their opponents into doing something about it. Whereas what happened in the Anglo-American countries that used first past the post is that left-wing parties found themselves isolated when they were in power, mercilessly attacked by media, and often self-censoring in their approach. They would say, well, we got to get reelected, we better not talk about that radical idea. Well, under PR, radical ideas could be floated until they weren't radical anymore. So I see where he's coming from. I just don't think the evidence supports his conclusions today. Yes?
So you referenced Northern Europe, which is arguably demographically much more parallel to the Canadian circumstance. I don't understand why Canadians are so reluctant to look at the best functioning countries on the planet and not want to go to that system. Where is this tendency, well, Canada's a great country, so we better not change. But here's this other set of countries, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, Netherlands, killing it.
Yeah.
Like, just the most progressive policies in the world. Why are we so reluctant to go there?
You know, it's interesting. I was at the Ontario Legislature, Queen's Park, earlier in the week for a lobby day. They had me there talking to MPPs, members of the provincial parliament, and a bunch of Liberals came to it, who are, of course, the government right now in Ontario. And the classic line, right? If the guy comes in, oh, Canada's the best country in the world. Why would we want to change our institutions? Everything's great here. Well, everything may be great for you, right? But, you know, there's a lot of people in this country that are suffering. It's a fundamentally political question. You know, when you can get a deliberative moment to have a discussion about what works and what doesn't for people, you get really good results. Our citizens' assemblies have come back in both cases with recommendations for proportional voting. And interestingly, the Netherlands had a citizens' assembly on its voting system as well, and they voted to keep their proportional system. Right? So it's not just a case of the ins versus the outs or novelty. When actual citizens come together and work through the challenges of governing and representation, they tend to respond to fairness arguments. The reason why we don't see the discussion that you're talking about is politics, right? We have a voting system that has rewarded, two large parties at the national level who operate in a very clientelistic fashion as sort of patronage machines with very strong links to corporate Canada. They have no interest in opening up the political system. And what I know from studying the struggle over institutions around the world is that this is a fundamentally democratic struggle. Right? First past the post is a pre-democratic holdover. Right? Its roots are in the medieval system of representation in Britain or the multi-estate system across Europe. To the extent that we have dislodged that system, it was because of the challenges, the political challenges. And so that's our challenge today, is to try to get in front of people and say, do you want a system that's more representative? Do you want a system that will lead to more transparent government? Do you want a system that will prevent people from getting in power and rewarding their friends, rather than making the best policy for everyone?
I think a lot of it also has to do with Canadians' identity, like how this country was formed, and the root of our institutions and the rootness of our government institutions is really rooted in white supremacy. And there's so much internalized white supremacy that Canadians hold because it's embedded and ingrained in Canadian culture, that when we start to have conversations like this, people get this friction in their Canadian identity, and they don't really understand where it's coming from. And this proportional representation is not about, because first past the post is maintaining the norm, maintaining the systems of power, maintaining that privilege. And when we talk about taking that away, you're bumping up against people of power, and it makes people very uncomfortable. And as an Indigenous woman sitting here listening to this, I can't tell you how many times I'm sitting here and I'm so uncomfortable listening to you, the conversations that we're having, and I'm like, but that's not how this country was formed, and people really need to understand that. And we're talking about how our system is based on all the stuff from England, and people are so disconnected from that history of how this country was actually formed and how these systems of government were created and why they were created in the manner they were created. They were created for the white people. Indigenous people weren't people until 1960. And that's the reality of the systems of government that we have here. So if we can't be genuine and honest and have those uncomfortable conversations about how our systems of government perpetuate white supremacy, it's going to be really hard to make the bold and drastic changes that we really need to make. The room that we're sitting in.
Yeah. No, excellent points. And I would only add to that. that if we look at the origins of Canadian democracy, you know, it doesn't start in 1867, right? In 1867, what we had was what we call a liberal order, right? So very narrow franchise, basically wealthy white men could vote, just about nobody else could. It took up until about 1900 before even all white working men could vote. Right? So in other words, you know, even within the white privilege card cashes out at different levels for different groups of people.
Because whiteness is always shifting.
And well, yes, and so part of it is breaking that whiteness coalition and getting people to see that, you know, the privilege you're being offered with this is, you don't want this, right? There's something better waiting for you in a different kind of political coalition. And so you're absolutely right. One part of it involves searchingly looking at the past, but also recognizing the way in which the struggles, you know, the powerful have never given up power willingly, right? They've never granted any group access to the table because they were nice folks, right? It's always been a struggle, and we owe to whatever limited ability we have, the things that we take for granted today, to the labor movement, to the struggles, particularly in the 19th century, of organized labor to try to increase the franchise. So absolutely, you're dead on in driving people's attention back to some of those foundational issues, because people are just wrong. They're just wrong about, you know, where we started, and if they can come to grips with that, then they can give up those illusions, hopefully, and put things on a more solid basis, a more equitable basis. All right, see you over here.
You know, it's a little bit off track, but this is the place to mention this particular argument. And I would appreciate if you could just dash my argument to shreds, because I really want to go with PR. But having been at both the civic and at the provincial level, let me tell you that the proportional representation as it's been presented to me thus far suggests that there'll be a lot of people who are out there knocking on doors, establishing a relationship with a real constituency, real neighborhoods, real people, and a portion, if they win, of their representation will be people who do nothing on the weekends, don't have to go back to a constituency, who just take their party executive out to lunch once a week, or once a month.
Yeah.
When I was on council, I fought very hard for a award system. And we lost to the notion of, well, the partial award system, where some people would be elected at large, some people would be elected in a neighborhood. It failed. But at least you were still responsible to a geographic constituency. What about these people who are not responsible to a geographic constituency? I'm stuck with this neighborhood stuff.
Yep.
And what about guys in the suits just taking over the positions of power in the cabinet?
Right. No, an excellent question, and certainly I think one that comes up a lot, right? About, you know, how, and, you know, Charlie, stop me when I've run over time and just move me off the
You
stage.
have like 2 more minutes.
2 more minutes, okay. So the thing about the local is we should actually look at what goes on. What goes on in these other countries? Are people just kicking back in the smoke-filled room, you know, calling in their card on the party list, doing nothing? Because I think the evidence doesn't support that. If we look at countries that have different kinds of voting systems, first of all, they almost all have some geographic element. Now in Sweden, they'll have like multi-member ridings with 20 members elected in a multi-member riding. So in that sense, it's not as local as you're talking about. But interestingly, Sweden has a radically decentralized form of government. So their argument was, we need to put power at the level that people want it to be at. So their local government is invested with a considerable amount of power. Unlike our situation. There's an incentive for those politicians to say, you know what, we don't know all the details of this, so we're going to push it down to the level that really does know and can answer it. So that's one thing that happens. Nobody's talking about a party list system for Canada for obvious reasons, so we can set that one aside. The two main ones that we often hear about, of course, are the single transferable vote and mixed member proportional, both of which have a geographic element. Single transferable vote, different countries deal with it differently, but Ireland, incredibly local, right? So when we look at the experience of a century in Ireland, no one would argue in Ireland that those members aren't doing local service. In fact, just the opposite, right? There are complaints that they're too locally focused. So STB, because of the way it works, really does allow local communities to discipline local members. Mixed member proportional, again, we find that the arguments that it would end up with a group of list MPs who do nothing, that's not what's occurred. So if we look, for instance, at Germany and New Zealand, you have the local members who are very, very busy in their local communities, and then you have the list members who are also very busy in local communities. They are also assigned to local areas where the party has not won a seat. And they often set up an office in that local community to provide services to those people. So nobody gets out of the local work. Nobody gets out of having some sort of physical constituency where they are accountable to people who come, and want some retail politics. So I think those concerns are excellent concerns, but I don't think, when we look at the examples of what's happened, and again, don't forget, institutions are one thing, the culture is another. And the culture of this country is people expect something to happen locally. So if we switch to a proportional system, those expectations aren't going to change, right? The only thing that's going to change is that people are going to be able to find somebody that they agree with. Right now, if you are a women's rights advocate and you are in a riding with a conservative, there is no point in going to talk to that member about the things that you would like to see happen legislatively for women's rights. Come on. I mean, they're going to be very nice and polite, and they might help you get a form filled out for a government bureaucracy, but that's it. The stuff that matters in politics, that individual member is not going to do one damn thing for you. But in a PR system, you really will have options. Now, you'll be able to go to someone who really does believe in the things that you believe in, and they will hear what your concerns are, and they will act on those concerns. So I think that's a better kind of local representation. I don't know if that answers your question.
It's convinced me.
Right. Look, I gotta wrap up now. I can do this all day. But because I know Charlie's got other things that people need to do, and I don't want to take up all the time.
One more question.
Why don't I see if I can just take a bunch of questions and people can be really focused, okay? People can be really focused on their questions and we do a lightning round. And so I see a hand here, and back there, and there. So there's 4. Why don't we do those? Starting here.
Thoughts on lowering the voting age?
Okay?
So the connection between first past the post and with the vote. So the party has really been the platform to get someone elected, and they're going to follow what the party decides, no matter what has previously been said or what their own constituency says. How is that piece of our undemocratic part and how this impacts it?
Okay, good. All right, back.
I happen to think a maverick is a good thing for a political party, and it usually comes with local nominations. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the democratization, according to opinion and range of ideologies in a party list.
Okay. All right, and I saw one more. Was there one more hand? Yes, here.
How do you get out the message clearly so that voters can make an informed decision?
Okay, excellent question. I'll try to be very, very focused in my answers. Lowering the voting age, good idea. Why? Because right now, young voters come of age and they're often not institutionally embedded anywhere, right? So they're 18 years old and, maybe they have a job, maybe they're at university, who knows, right? Lower the voting age, and now you have them in high school where we can actually set up policies to help them engage with the political system and come to know what their responsibilities are. There are ways in which we can incorporate them into processes. In Norway, every high school student spends a week at a mini version of the Storting, which is across the street from the Storting, acting out the roles of government and opposition, debating different policies. Henry Miller writes about this in his books. Really exciting things that we could do. So yes, good idea. Versus local. The problem with this idea is that many people vote party. So when the party member does the party stuff, they're actually doing what those voters want, right? In fact, when a party member says, you know what, I'm going to do what I want, they are breaking what that person. Remember David Emerson, right? Got elected as a liberal, decided he was going to join the conservative government. His local people were mad as hell about that because he broke what they thought he had promised to do. Now, I'm not suggesting that there isn't a tension. There is a tension sometimes between what a local area wants and the party wants. And again, all of the versions of the voting systems that we are talking about allow for that tension to be manifest. So under STV, voters get to choose the kinds of people within the party that they want to support. So if there's some local maverick who's pushing some issue and offering up some debate within their party, and voters think that's important, they can make it a priority under an STV system. Under an MMP system, again, there's still local ridings, and if a local member finds themselves at odds with their party, they can strike out, and they can see if they can get themselves elected under some other terms. So you would still have that tension, either under a proportional system. Ideological differences within parties. I think, as I've said, parties are coalitions, and they run the gamut, a spectrum of beliefs. And that's good, right? I mean, the whole thing about democracy is we're allowed to disagree, right? That's the great accomplishment of democracy, is that we can disagree and we leave our swords and cudgels at home, okay? So the idea that we could have a robust discussion within our parties about the way forward is a good thing. And the nomination process in a multi-member riding would allow for a range of people. It would allow for a Sven Robinson and someone else to be, part of the mix.
That's what I was thinking of, not Dave Emerson.
Again, so yes, I think that when we look at there's many different ways to do this, as there are countries that are doing it, right? I mean, New Zealand put within its rules explicit legislative requirements that parties demonstrate an internally democratic process for choosing the members of their lists, okay? But other countries end up in the same place, and guess who leads? Progressive forces, right? Progressive forces, not surprisingly, because they're more open to democracy, more committed to democracy, led in terms of their internal democratization, and guess what happened? Other parties followed suit, because they were embarrassed or shamed into it. We want a political system where that kind of dynamism is going on, because that's how progressive ideas spill over into the mainstream. It's that contagion effect, and to have that happen, you need a really competitive political dynamic. How to get the message out? I'll tell you what not to do. Don't talk about how the systems work. Don't talk about the Drew quota, right? Don't talk, nobody knows anything about the institutional functions of these systems, but the people who don't want change, they want to talk about it all the time, right? They want to get you on talk shows and they want to say, well, gee Dennis, how would we actually add up those votes? No, death. Do not. Go there, right? Selling a voting system is like selling a car. You talk about performance. Oh, sure, there's some geeks who go there and they pull up the hood and they play with the spark plugs, but most people don't. Most people want to know, what kind of gas mileage am I going to get out of this, right? How is it on hills, right? Can I put the family in the back seat? And it's the same with voting systems. You have to talk about what is the bright, paradisic future that we envision with this system. What kind of results will it typically produce? And frankly, I think that if people make that case for first past the post, they will kill themselves, right? Yeah, our system allows a minority to dominate everyone. Our system pretty much guarantees that very few people will get what they want when they vote. Our system will act as a barrier. I mean, they use code. They talk about extremism. They talk about instability. Well, you know what? Democracy is instability. Democracy is an opportunity for us to make change through peaceful means, through discussion and deliberation, and sometimes through voting. So, you want to sell PR? First thing you do is make people aware of the things that aren't working in our current system. If this is a referendum about first past the post, we'll win, right? If this is a referendum about the minutiae of STV, we're going to lose. So really, we need that best man for the job innovation. We need that kind of a poster to say, this is what change could look like. And doesn't change sound like a good thing? I'm here all day. Come and talk with me.